Welcome to the Daily AI News Digest. This broadcast is sponsored by bestai.org. Today is July 3, 2026. Let's skip the noise and get right into the data, capital flows, and policy shifts that are actually dictating today's market reality.
We're kicking things off with a massive macro development. OpenAI is proposing to transfer a 5% equity stake straight to the United States government. At current private valuations, we're talking about a $15 billion financial alignment.
Next, we're looking at the shifting economics of compute. Anthropic is aggressively pivoting to custom hardware, stepping into early talks with Samsung for a 2-nanometer custom accelerator as industry infrastructure costs hit historic highs.
And finally, we'll evaluate the cold reality of enterprise software integration right now. Microsoft is deploying a brand new unit backed by $2.5 billion and 6,000 employees just to fight off enterprise adoption friction.
Okay, moving into our first section, the biggest moves today concerning capital and sovereign alignment.
So let's put this OpenAI proposal into perspective. The company's private valuation is sitting above $300 billion right now. A 5% equity transfer equals about $15 billion. If this actually goes through, it's the largest voluntary equity transfer to the federal government we have ever seen on record. The takeaway here is a calculated strategic shift. OpenAI clearly views its relationship with Washington not just as basic regulatory compliance, but as a fundamental strategic partnership requiring real financial alignment.
Looking at the broader market, heavy capital is still flooding into infrastructure, especially platforms that offer an alternative to the major closed model ecosystems. Crusoe is in the middle of negotiating a $3 billion funding round to expand its AI data centers. Meanwhile, Kling AI just raised $2 billion as it spins out of its parent company, Kuaishou. Concurrently, Together AI locked down an $800 million Series C. What's notable here, that round is led by Aramco Ventures. It's another clear signal of sovereign wealth financing the core architecture of this entire industry.
And Together AI's substantial raise is backed by some very hard financial metrics. We're talking $1.15 billion in annualized bookings. This data point highlights a definitive market trend. Enterprise clients are actively migrating over to open-source neoclouds. These specialized, cost-effective infrastructure providers are allowing companies to step away from proprietary systems, and they're reporting operating cost reductions of up to 80%. That is a massive margin shift.
All right, Section 2. Let's look at product and model realities, specifically around hardware and implementation.
Across the sector right now, the major research labs are being forced to aggressively pivot their hardware strategies. Off-the-shelf silicon simply isn't economically viable at this scale anymore. Anthropic is in early-stage talks with Samsung Electronics to build a 2-nanometer custom accelerator. This is a direct counter to OpenAI, which recently deployed its Broadcom-built inference chip, codenamed Jalapeno, which, by the way, is designed strictly to run models, not train them. To speed up their own timeline, Anthropic brought on Clive Chan, a former engineer from OpenAI's custom silicon team. So this is officially moved from a research idea to active, heavily resourced development.
For Anthropic, this hardware pivot isn't some luxury project. It's a strict mathematical necessity. Their annualized revenue run rate just crossed the $30 billion mark, which actually pushes them past OpenAI in revenue metrics. When you operate at that scale, custom silicon becomes absolutely mandatory if you want to maintain your operating margins and reduce your absolute reliance on Nvidia's supply chain.
Meanwhile, on the software side, the market is colliding with some cold realities regarding adoption. Enterprise integration is stalling. To fix this, Microsoft is launching a subsidiary called Microsoft Frontier Co. This is a $2.5 billion unit deploying roughly 6,000 employees with a single directive: physically assist clients with model selection and workflow integration. This comes right on the heels of a 21% decline in Microsoft stock this year, and it closely mirrors a $1 billion move Amazon made to put engineers directly inside client offices. The reality is, selling AI software today requires serious, brute force human capital.
Moving on to Section 3, Regulation and Policy, breaking down federal and state mandates.
Starting at the federal level, President Trump signed an executive order targeting AI cybersecurity and frontier models. The timeline here is aggressive. Federal agencies, including the Treasury, NSA, and CISA, have a strict 60-day window to set up classified benchmarking processes. By August 1st, a framework will go live for developers to engage with the government before they release highly advanced models.
Now, you really have to pay attention to the precise language in this directive. It explicitly avoids mandatory licensing or pre-clearance regimes. Instead, it sets up a strictly voluntary pre-release engagement channel for developers building what the order calls covered frontier models. The core focus here is strictly on mitigating cybersecurity vulnerabilities and sharing intelligence with critical infrastructure groups.
But in sharp contrast to that voluntary federal approach, the state-level regulatory environment is getting highly prescriptive. California just enacted AB 2148, which legally mandates that all public school employees and contractors must be human. Over in Rhode Island, they've signed bills forcing chatbot operators to build in strict protocols for self-harm and suicidal ideation. And in Pennsylvania, the House passed legislation that criminalizes unauthorized deepfake intimate imagery. If you're an enterprise legal team or a developer listening to this, your compliance overhead just multiplied overnight across state lines.
That brings us to Section 4, the analyst's take on these market realities.
Let's synthesize what this all means. First, looking at the neoclouds, the massive surge in infrastructure funding proves that these specialized providers are successfully capitalizing on enterprise cost fatigue. Companies like Together AI and Crusoe are stepping in with viable, heavily capitalized alternatives to the closed model ecosystems. They're driving down the cost of inference and capturing serious market share in the process.
So to summarize the broader market dynamics right now, market leadership is currently being dictated by sovereign financial alignment. We're seeing this clearly with Aramco's investments in OpenAI's U.S. government proposal. Second, custom silicon has graduated from an experimental phase. It is now a mandatory cost control mechanism for giants like Anthropic and OpenAI. Third, AI software revenue relies entirely on brute force human implementation, as we just saw with Microsoft and Amazon. And finally, the rapid fragmentation of state-level regulations is drastically inflating compliance overhead for everyone in the space.
So, the defining question for the remainder of the quarter is this. As infrastructure scales and sovereign interests align, which developers can actually bridge the gap between frontier models and real-world enterprise integration? Because having the most mathematically capable model is entirely secondary if it can't be cost-effectively integrated into enterprise workflows while navigating a highly fragmented legal map. That wraps up today's market overview. Thank you for joining this daily AI News Digest Explainer. Be sure to check out our sponsor, bestai.org, for continued, factual tracking of these business realities.